Is Bangladesh on the brink? A violent crackdown on protesters has paused, but core grievances remain unresolved. Will Bangladesh face renewed instability, or can the controversial government of Sheikh Hasina restore calm? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Bangladesh. At least 150 Bangladeshis are now dead, over 1,000 have been arrested, and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is facing arguably the biggest challenge ever to her decades in power. Her Awami League's controversial re-election 6 months ago angered many, with an opposition boycott and remarkably low voter turnout. But the government seemed to have settled in despite objections until last week. What started as a single-issue student protest morphed into more of a movement, which Hasina says has been orchestrated by her political opponents. Still, the government's response to protesters was to unleash the full force of the police, cut communications, and impose a curfew. Here's a look.
Student protests have rocked Bangladesh. They started weeks ago over the quota system for government jobs. It was first introduced in 1972, but abolished by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government in 2018 following protests. But last month, a court reinstated the system. Based on the quotas, 30% of government jobs are reserved for the children and grandchildren of freedom fighters in the 1971 Independence War. So-called backward groups, women, minorities and the physically disabled share 26%, leaving only 44% to be allocated on merit. Protesters demanded all quotas except the last two be scrapped.
Many talented students are leaving Bangladesh, and one of the main reasons is this quota system. A country where 56% in government jobs is reserved for the entitled people, where there is no place for deserving people.
They also say the quota for the relatives of war veterans favours the supporters of the ruling Awami League, which led the country's independence movement. Under Sheikh Hasina's reign, Bangladesh has seen significant economic growth, but since the COVID-19 pandemic, the economy has been faltering. Inflation is hovering at around 10%, and job growth has stagnated, and youth unemployment is a big problem. An official survey conducted last year shows nearly 40% of Bangladeshis between the ages of 18 and 29 were not working or studying. And despite the past economic successes, income inequality has deepened.
My son passed his higher secondary exam and I'm educating him so that he can get a job. The reason we are joining them is so that if our children have the merit, they will get the jobs. But now children of freedom fighters who have no merit get the job easily.
Last week, the demonstrations turned violent after the Awami League's student wing attacked the protesters in Dhaka University. The government responded with force. Hasina deployed the army, imposed a curfew and shut down internet services. More than 140 protesters have been killed in one of the worst episodes of violence the country has seen.
They are firing openly. 3 of my brothers are already dead at the hospital. A bullet hit the head of another brother and I just brought him to the hospital. See, there are blood stains on my hands. Why are my hands colored with blood of my brothers?
But after days of unrest, protesters won a partial victory after the Supreme Court scrapped most of the quotas on Sunday. It cut the quota for relatives of veterans to 5%, 2% for minorities and the disabled, with 93% now allocated on merit. Speaking a day after the ruling, Hasina said the situation will improve slowly. She also blamed the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party and Jamaat-e-Islami Party and their student organizations for the violence.
Shibir is a militant group. It was the attacks of the militants. They slit the throat of a man and left him around the Dhaka college. He was a normal worker. He used to vote for us. Who cut the throat? They also cut the hands, legs. They also killed the Jatra League men, throwing them from a roof. Who did these heinous things? Jamaat is also militant, and the BNP, their real face also came out.
An uneasy calm returned to Dhaka on Monday. But despite the scaling back of job quotas, the economic and political anger against Sheikh Hasina's rule might prove harder to quell.
So did the government go too far to quell these protests, and will there be consequences? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, President of the Awami League UK, Sultan Mahmud Shariff. Also from London, Joint Secretary for the Office Portfolio for the Bangladesh Nationalist Party's UK branch, Mohammed Rahman. And from Washington, Director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute, Michael Kugelman. Thanks all so much for being with me. Michael, I'll start with you and get an observer's perspective. I mean, Bangladesh has seen levels of instability before, but this is unique. So I'd first like to get your impression of what's actually happening here and whether you think the worst is now behind us.
Well, I would argue that this is really the biggest challenge and really the biggest crisis that Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister Hasina, has faced over her 15 straight years in power in Bangladesh. This was something that began as a peaceful protest against a particular policy, or the reinstatement of job quotas. But what happened in recent days is that it morphed into something much more serious and something that became indeed quite violent. And I think that it ended up becoming something that entailed many members of the public in Bangladesh, particularly students, but not just students, acting on what had been longstanding grievances that they harbored toward the state and toward the government, particularly regarding things like state repression. And indeed, things have calmed down a bit now, but I don't see this crisis as being done with, given that this is about so much more than the job quotas. Indeed, the Supreme Court did have a court decision to essentially cut down drastically the number of quotas that would be set aside for the most controversial types of jobs. Of course, those being jobs that would be set aside for relatives of the freedom fighters in the '71 war. But there is a lot of anger. I mean, it's very clear just from the images that you're showing here. There's a tremendous amount of anger, and it's going to be very difficult to walk that back.
Yeah, and Michael, I have to ask you this as well. If you can please help us understand what the government really wants as far as the quota system is concerned. The Awami League actually moved to abolish it in 2018, but a lower court then ruled against it. Now, protesters are again asking for it to be at the very least radically altered, and the Supreme Court agreed with that. So what is the problem now?
Well, I'm afraid that the government appeared to think that by doing everything it could to address the proximate cause of the protests, that of the job quotas, that the crisis would subside. But that's not the case, just because there's so much anger that lies beyond that. And indeed, here you have to get into the issues, and I'm sure we'll get into this, the way in which the government responded, which entailed the use of force. Let's be very clear on that. The protesters turned violent themselves, or some of them did at least. But I think that for many of those that have been protesting and many others in Bangladesh, there's a lot of anger about how the government responded, not just in terms of what the police did and the border troops that were called in, what they did, but also the rhetorical responses, the messaging and the rhetoric from Sheikh Hasina herself, which included linking to the protesters to the collaborators that work with the Pakistan Army in the '71 war. That's extremely provocative language to use at a very sensitive moment.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that, but first let me ask Sultan Mahmud. I mean, is this indeed the biggest challenge then to Sheikh Hasina and your Awami League, and how did it get so out of control?
The protesters, to start with, the protesters were protesting on a subject which was at that time in the hand of the court to decide. That was because of a high court verdict. And that was, the students were happy with that. And before it could go to the higher court to settle what discuss and decide about by the Supreme Court main body, this was some people, some intruders entered into the meetings of the students, and in an organized way, the BNP and Jamaat.
Okay. Well, then let me ask.
Help this thing instigated, ignited, and the commentator before me surprisingly said Sheikh Hasina commented the wrong thing about Sheikh Hasina. Sheikh Hasina did not say anything against the collaborators or anything.
Yeah, I'd like to speak further about that, but before you go too far, let me ask Mohammed about what you have said thus far about the line of the government that says this is now actually about political opposition, not about what the protesters were out for, that the political opposition is actually responsible for most of the violence, for the snowballing, really, of these protests that we've seen. What does the BNP say about that?
First of all, thank you for having me today. Actually, it was not a part of BNP initially, because as you know, in Bangladesh, when a prime minister or government minister take the oath of the office, they swear to faithfully execute their duties without fear or favor, and to uphold the constitution and the laws of the country. So what happened, the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, like other ministers, took an oath to govern the impartiality and uphold the constitution. However, she herself admitted to abolishing the quota system for government jobs out of anger in 2018. This is very important. She categorically accepted in a press conference in Bangladesh, which contradicts her commitment to the constitution. Students who protested in 2018, they were demanding to reform, not abolishing the system. So in first hand, why she abolished the whole system? Because if she abolished it, there is no quota. It means she contradicts the constitution. And if she now saying it, I did it by anger, she's break her oath. So two ways she break the constitution. Problem is the autocratic regime. What they're happening for last 15 years, without there is no accountability, there is no election, proper election, there is no proper mandate. This makes them so autocratic mentality, and I would say because of that, a small protest turned around a whole country anger. If you look at this international media and human rights organizations, they have reported that country is whole anger. And what began, like we have seen, like you, a peaceful demonstration on university campus against a quota system only. In just 5 days, hundreds of students and opposition activists have been killed. The government has made it increasingly difficult to obtain even information by shutting down internet.
We've said that in the introduction as well, but I can tell Sultan Mahmud had a lot to say to your position. Mohammed, let me just let Sultan Ahmed respond quickly. Very quickly, Sultan Ahmed, I could see you want.
It was an elected government, elected by the people of Bangladesh. They had the mandate of entire people. They did not, the BNP and Jamaat, they didn't have it. They did not, the BNP didn't contest any election. So how can you say that the government was not constitutional government? First thing, those who think that the government is not constitutional, they are unconstitutional in every respect and in every kind. And they created this agitation and this massacre in the whole country.
Let me get back to Michael then about that, because, Michael, I mean, now we're back to what we actually discussed 6 months ago and questioning, as some Bangladeshis do, the actual legitimacy of the election that brought the Awami League, re-elected them back to power. It's still in question. The BNP in particular says that they were never legitimately re-elected, that the entire election was actually a sham. There are also analysts that agree with that. But now we are where we are, and as you said before, you think this is further accumulation of the biggest challenge, what has now become the biggest challenge to the Awami League's rule. So where does this go from here? Do you think we're, like you said, the worst probably isn't behind us? So what will Bangladeshis do from now forward?
Well, I mean, several of the protest leaders have indicated that they will come back on the streets if their demands are not met, and many of their demands, most of their demands, have nothing to do with the quota system. They have to do with things like having government ministers that they believe are responsible for perpetrating violence to resign. They've also called for the heads of several universities who they believe didn't do enough to stop violence to resign. There are a number of other demands that they've made, and that they have not been met. But in terms of down the road, what could be coming, I would argue that Prime Minister Hasina, despite being in power for 15 years, I would argue that her legitimacy has been a bit fragile for quite some time, especially since the last election, which indeed she came back when the opposition boycotted. But I think that another issue here that's made her legitimacy more fragile is the economic situation. She has done, there's many things that she has done very successfully over her time in power. One is shepherding one of the most remarkable growth stories in South Asia, or in Asia on the whole, but economic stress has gotten worse. And this is one reason why there was so much anger: unemployment issues, inflation issues, and so on. And so now, given that, for her to now have to grapple with the aftermath of these protests, where you have so many angry people, given how the government responded, given that the internet was cut off for nearly a week, given that the army was called in, which is the first time that Sheikh Hasina has done that over her 15 years. So I just think this will. Sorry, I'll end here.
Who is responsible for that?
I am not.
Why it happened?
I am not, I certainly acknowledge
Michael,
that
but let me ask you this on Sultan's behalf. Is there at least an element here of certain opposition parties, not even necessarily the BNP, but Jamaat Ismail, as he's been saying, is there an element of them using this opportunity to push further momentum against the government to perhaps get their way, push Sheikh Hasina out of power, force her to resign? Is there an element of this?
Right. Yeah, I don't think she'll be pushed out of power, but absolutely. I mean, the opposition did not orchestrate or begin these protests. They were sparked by organic public protest. But certainly there is something that they could exploit. I certainly cannot rule out the possibility that they might have infiltrated the protest, and that some of the violence perpetrated by protesters could actually have been members of the opposition, whether the Jamaat or the BNP or factions linked to the opposition like the Jamaat. But I think it's important to emphasize that these were not political protests initially. These were not staged by the opposition. They were staged by students, and that's different from what we've seen, say, end of 2022, where you had a pretty large protest against Sheikh Hasina. It was led by the BNP. That's why I think this is more serious for Sheikh Hasina, given that this is the public. This is not a political thing. This is the broader public acting on longstanding grievances.
Okay, Sultan Mahmud. In hindsight, then, do you think your government could have at least better controlled the response? Go ahead.
Now, my government, I stop you here. My government allowed the students, despite they were told time without number by the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina that the courts it is in the hand of the courts, and whatever the court decide, it will in her thought and her experience, it will go in favor of you. Despite that, they were pushed by anti-Bangladesh elements and foreign agents into a condition which favored BNP and Jamaat to destabilize the whole country. And that is what in the guise of students, they entered with the students, and all the damages has been done. People who have been on the spot arrested are not students. They were criminals from BNP and Jamaat.
Okay, let the BNP respond then. Is there any truth to that?
Mr. Shariff said that BNP did not participate in the election. Could I ask, before the election, January 2024, how and why they have arrested, and there's a more than few thousands verdict suddenly within last 3 months before the election?
Yeah,
why?
I stop you there.
Let me finish, Mr. Shariff. Yeah, please let me finish. It's one after another.
Answered that question.
Okay, one after another.
What were they
one after
doing
another, you have to
in the
speak.
high?
Okay,
One
Sultan
after another.
Mahmud, please let Mohammed finish. We can't understand either of you.
We should know the norm. We should speak one after another.
Yes,
Okay?
Mohammed,
You can say
continue,
whatever you
please.
want. Right. Okay. They gave a few thousand verdict within few months. And can you see miraculously, after January election, there is not any verdict anymore. Those are potential candidates. Those are activists and leaders. All of them, they give few thousands verdict within a couple of months. So all the judiciary in the hand of government. And you can see, it's not protest of BNP or other opposition parties. It was by the students. And what happened, this you can see the Channel 4 footage just a couple of days ago, showing a protester being tossed onto the side of the road by Bangladeshi police and then barely alive, thrown over a road barrier and left for dead. These atrocities are being committed by government law enforcement agencies. Who is saying? Channel 4. And you can see yesterday, I was just going to tell you, just yesterday, Deutsche Welle report saying UN Secretary General also has expressed his serious concern over reports that authorities had deployed vehicles with UN marking. Can I finish, Mom? Vehicles with UN marking during the Bangladeshi riots, which is clearly indicates that the governments are handled or taking part all of the law enforcement agencies. You can see the ex-army chief, who is now under corruption, ex-police chiefs. He is also in Bangladesh. All the people, international, national and international media saying he is a corrupted person. So it means this government categorically ruined all the institutions. It's not only protest. And these things, what happened, they did not take any sort of accountability. And these things happen for themselves now. Because people did not want maybe any sort of
We're down to our last few minutes.
These are big parts now.
Okay.
But now, time is now.
Sultan Mahmud, can I ask you though quickly if you think it's possible that if Sheikh Hasina and your leadership with the Awami League, please, we've only got a few minutes left. So Sultan Mahmud, if Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League perhaps at least acknowledge that the police did behave in a particularly brutal way, even if they believe the opposition has inspired some of this.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
When the police sees murder, massacre, destruction, then they have to act. That is their duty. And they exactly did their duty. And they found that it was not the students. It is this BNP Jamaat criminals who were doing the damage to all the properties, buildings, the internet, and everything. That is why the police acted. Police did not act with malice. They acted because they had a duty, and they performed their duty wonderfully.
May I ask you one thing?
There will be no apologies.
Students, have they found any sort of opposition activists when they murdered all the innocent students? Have they found any BNP or other opposition parties activists there? All of them are students. So why, if they believe all the massacre happening by BNP and other opposition parties, why are they killing the student then? So they have to be accountable for killing the innocent students.
Okay, we can see you two are not going to agree on the measures that the police took. They seem to have completely different motivations, according to both your analyses. Okay, I need to get a final question in for Michael. Sorry, gentlemen, if I can ask you. We understand you completely disagree on the police and what they acted on. But Michael, there's one final question here that we need to ask, and actually it was alluded to in one of the earlier answers. What are the regional now and global implications of all of this? Because Bangladesh has this quite unique position in South Asia. It's a Muslim nation. It has a strong relationship, however, with India, as well as with China and with the United States. And all of those nations have worked relatively well with Sheikh Hasina and her government. So what are their interests now, and how much do those matter?
Well, certainly India is probably Bangladesh's closest and most influential friend. And India has long worried about the prospect of some political alternative to Sheikh Hasina and her party. India views the opposition much like the Awami League does, as a dangerous Islamist force. So I think that this instability, it's something that India will worry could galvanize the opposition in ways that could be problematic for India's interests. But I think that the economic implications are significant. We know about Bangladesh's growth story. And yet, we've seen the impact. There's been significant economic damage just over the last week or so. The internet shut down,
right.
And again, people had already been talking about rising inflation and so on. And Bangladesh is a key player in South Asia, and it's also a player that's respected on the global stage. So the image, the reputational costs are very significant for Bangladesh's government.
That will unfortunately have to be the final word, gentlemen, because we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.